Consumers have already begun reevaluating their relationship with alcohol, which has me contemplating if another mainstream euphoric is next. On average, how many drinks do you consume daily? No, I'm not talking about alcohol, but caffeine containing beverages. And I'm actually curious how many. So pause this really quick and leave that number down in the comments section. Plus, to keep this conversation two sided, I'll share how my caffeinated lifestyle started and has evolved over the years. I first started consuming caffeine in the form of sugar free Red Bull or Monster energy drinks to get through late night study sessions at Kent State University. That caffeine consumption expanded into pre workout supplements when I met some college friends that were into amateur bodybuilding. At the time, I didn't think twice about how much caffeine I was consuming because just about every other young person I knew was slamming coffees or energy drinks, mixing up brightly colored pre workout powders, or ingesting caffeine pills. Today, and I'm going to preface this by saying that despite getting endless shipments of energy drinks and pre workout supplements sent to me, and having every opportunity to overdo it because of having a newborn baby, I keep my average caffeine intake at around 400 milligrams. That's spread out into two consumption occasions. I'm currently working out in the early morning, so that's when I consume a modest pre workout supplement powder. And then at lunchtime, I usually crack open a tasty performance energy drink. So, not too shabby, or at least I don't think so, especially considering that the FDA cites 400 milligrams as the amount of caffeine not generally associated with dangerous negative effects for healthy adults. But as my own 2 decade long journey just alluded, caffeine consumption has deeply integrated into our daily lives. Caffeine is cited as the most widely used psychoactive drug in the world, becoming such a socially accepted, ingrained practice that we seldom question its long term effects on our health. And before I go any further in this content, it needs to be explicitly stated that I don't believe caffeine itself is inherently good or bad. Rather, a person's relationship with it determines its impact. Just like any addictive substance, we develop a tolerance to caffeine over time. What starts as a morning cup of coffee or an energy drink can easily transform into three or four to feel the same stimulating effect. The dependence on caffeine creates an ever increasing cycle of consumption, with justifications ranging from needing it to wake up to increasing concentration at work. But what happens when more people start reconsidering how and why they use caffeine? Right now, consumer surveys seem to signal the marketplace could be in the very early stage of searching to find a healthier relationship with caffeine. This is not unlike what was happening in the early 2010s with alcohol, when the organization Alcohol Change UK officially launched Dry January. That first year, which I believe was 2013, it had something like 4,000 people sign up. But it has now grown into an international cultural phenomenon where millions annually explore temporary alcohol abstinence as a healthy way to start the new year. And the popularity of Dry January is cited as a key contributor to the broader consumer trend of cutting back on alcohol. So let's play this out a bit. Could there be a pattern in consumer behavior emerging that helps establish a data informed prediction regarding caffeine? From what I've seen, there has been two broader consumer behavior trends that evolved from Dry January: mindful drinking and sober curious. These two concepts sometimes get used interchangeably, but have nuanced differences that could impact total beverage consumption and commercial activity. Mindful drinking is about being present and intentional with alcohol consumption. For one person, that might be limiting yourself to one drink a night. For another, that may be meaning abstaining during the week and drinking lightly on the weekends. The scenarios are really endless, from avoiding consumption completely, replacing with water or soft drinks or alcohol free beverages, or tempering consumption by mixing in non alcoholic drink options at a certain tempo. According to the CDC, about two-thirds of US adults consumed alcohol in the past year. And that number is consistent with recent Gallup surveys. But why I bring up these statistics is because with mindful drinking, it emphasizes the quality of the drinking experience rather than complete alcohol abstinence. That makes it a potentially more appealing, manageable, incremental change to a broader set of individuals. Alternatively, the conscious exploration of a life without alcohol consumption is considered being sober curious. And since the late 1930s, after Prohibition, the percentage of US adults surveyed that claim total abstinence from alcohol has stayed relatively consistent. But the reason why the sober curious lifestyle commands so much attention from beverage entrepreneurs is because of the powerful effects from generational shift. Underage drinking among US teens has declined over the last 20 years, and Gen Z are more broadly questioning societal norms around alcohol. 47% of Gen Z state they'd never had an alcoholic drink. That's up from 36% of millennials when surveyed at a comparable period. But whether consumers are choosing to cut back on alcohol or are sober curious, Dry January has also fed into my thesis that demand breeds commercialization activity. There is now a huge variety of alcohol free beverage options to choose from that are great tasting, wellness focused, and widely available. So, what happens when the same effects are applied to the broader consumer trend of cutting back on caffeine? From my understanding, there hasn't been that event based catalyst like Dry January for caffeine yet, but maybe it could possibly come from a sleep organization that sees the solution to needing more rest and energy not being a substance that ultimately leaves us feeling more exhausted and dependent. Regardless, I have noticed an uptick in both social media chatter around reduction and self motivated abstinence challenges around caffeine. Let's then assume the same types of general consumer behavior trends sprout from it. Instead of mindful drinking, maybe it's dubbed mindful stimulation, where it's about being present and intentional about caffeine consumption. And as a replacement to the sober curious movement, we have decaf curious individuals consciously exploring a life without caffeine consumption. Since this consumer behavior shift hasn't even crossed the chasm towards early majority adoption yet, the idea of caffeine reduction might seem silly. Plus, compared to alcohol, many more US adults, to the tune of slightly more than 90%, regularly consume caffeine. But reflecting on the history of humanity, we can see how certain practices, once normalized, are now seen as harmful or strange. It could very well be likely that caffeine consumption will eventually join these obsolete practices. Future generations could wonder why we chose to subject ourselves to this cycle of dependence and exhaustion, especially when there are healthier alternatives to maintain our energy and concentration. And that's a great transition into this final part of the content. But before I explore today's trending alternatives for those seeking to reduce or abstain from caffeine consumption, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the long history of substitutes. The original cereal war founders of John Harvey Kellogg and Charles William Post believed that caffeine was unhealthy. And in 1895, Post created a powdered roasted wheat bran and molasses beverage called Postum that's still sold today across grocery stores. Then, a decade later, a German merchant and coffee pioneer invented the first commercially successful decaffeination process that left all the coffee taste without what he thought was poison. So, caffeine alternatives are not new. In fact, they had a three-quarters of a century head start compared to the invention of non alcoholic beer. And that might be a significant point to remember when considering the caffeine reduction adoption rate and overall impact. But if we follow those same top consumer needs that attract buyers to non alcoholic products mentioned by Nielsen IQ, they also align with the predicted mindful stimulation and decaf curious consumer behavior trends. If we start with a major aspect of the drinking better, not more consumer need, I can very much see a similar transition happening with decaf coffee as what happened with non alcoholic beer. These are the keystone beverages of the alcohol and energy categories, yet both became stale compared to today's taste and experience standards. But improvements in the extraction process, roasting, and specialty preparations are changing the poor tasting reputation of decaf coffee. Additionally, continual focus on wellness will drive the market towards decaf coffee being something cool and not just for older drinkers and people who can't handle a little caffeine. But beyond decaf coffee, I believe the heightened wellness consumer mindset opens a whole remixed world of energy everything. Since we live in the age of the endless aisle, there will naturally be more options in every CPG category than during any other point in our history. This ease of purchasing and availability across sales channels will allow for a frictionless shopping experience for mindful stimulation and decaf curious consumers that only helps speed up the caffeine reduction trend. On the coffee side of remixed energy everything, We already see various decaf options, whether it's at home, food service, or RTD beverage offerings. Similarly, the market is starting to see more caffeine free alternatives, such as chicory root or fig coffee. Another major trend is cutting caffeine for functional mushrooms, most notably popularized by brands Four Sigmatic and Mudwater. Then there's the slightly less caffeine and many more nutritional benefits containing cousin of coffee, which is tea. As we look to the future of tea, we should see a blend of tradition and innovation focused on health orientated products that's coupled with a growing interest in consumers' appetite for variety and experimentation that I think really supports a shift towards more conscious caffeine consumption. And we already see various tea options from matcha and yerba mate to black or green, whether it's at home, food service, or RTD beverage offerings. Even Dr. Andrew Huberman is giving coffee alternatives a boost of health expert influencer Cole through his majority investment in a yerba mate beverage brand at the beginning of 2024. But some of these offerings, especially RTD beverages, are intentionally positioning within the growing energy drinks market and product packaging mentioning it as a tea based energy drink. Moreover, traditional energy drinks are getting a facelift because of the performance and wellness market fragmentation. These more approachable and neutral marketing brands are broadening the audience for energy drinks, with many of these energy drinks having 200 milligrams or lower from natural caffeine sources like green coffee beans. You've also seen an uptick in nootropic ingredients being added into energy drinks or supplements to provide a boost of focus and elevated mental cognition. And then finally, but certainly not least, there's an interesting caffeine related ingredient that's been getting traction within the sports nutrition market. Also, I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record at this point, but biased or not, I've always believed the sports nutrition space was the often imitated, never duplicated, influential epicenter of the entire ingestible CBG space. And the proof is in the disruption of the $22 billion US energy drinks market. So it's probably best to pay attention to this bleeding edge comment next. Infinity is the branded ingredient known scientifically as paraxanthin, which is one of three downstream metabolites of caffeine. Of these three metabolites, when caffeine is ingested, approximately 80% is converted into paraxanthin. It's also the most experiential, least toxic caffeine metabolite, and the safest for the most of the population. As stated earlier, most of the commercialization has been within the capsule or powdered supplement categories, but Update was the first to utilize Infinity in an RTD energy drink. But I just wanted to end with some quick final thoughts. You might have been able to kind of read between the lines at the beginning of the content that I've been on this personal journey, questioning the motives behind my overall consumption of all things and seeking healthier alternatives. It started about 6 to 7 years ago when I decided to practice mindful drinking as an unprompted precaution because of my family history of alcoholism. A few years later, after that, when my wife and I had some fertility troubles, I started exploring my relationship with caffeine and eventually decided to cut average daily consumption. I can responsibly drink alcohol and caffeine, so it's about taking steps towards a more balanced and healthier life instead of completely freeing myself from some type of addiction. My assumption is that most consumers share that ability and eventual interest in caffeine reduction rather than opting for a completely decaffeinated lifestyle. But it's important to remember that caffeine is caffeine, regardless of the source. So individuals prone to overconsumption and dissociation can experience these effects with any caffeinated beverage. Finally, I'm not saying that the dynamic growth in caffeinated beverages is over. On the contrary, I expect energy everything to continue growing at a solid pace over the immediate foreseeable future as caffeine's ability to effectively deliver energy consistently proves to be valued more highly by today's consumers than avoiding its negative side effects. But I do believe small incremental consumption shifts, likely towards non traditional caffeine reduction products, will eventually create a material impact. But I hope you enjoyed this YouTube video. If you did, consider hitting that like button to support me. Also, help me get to my new short term goal of 4,000 subscribers by hitting that subscribe button. I'd love to see you join me on this journey, but we need to fix the fact that slightly more than 90% of you that are watching this YouTube video right now are not subscribed to my channel, and that makes me extremely sad. But I do want to thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.